Let's talk about national elections in September in Norway. Now, bear with me. The reason I want to talk about this is because the Green Party there have come out fighting against the aviation industry. They are calling for an introduction of personal quotas for air travel, so you can only travel a certain amount in the air every year. Eoghan Corry is the editor of Air and Travel magazine. Eoghan, what would you say to people here who think this sounds like an awfully good idea?
It sounds like a crazy idea. It's going to be not going to achieve what it set out to do, but it will be particularly damaging for Ireland and for the peripheral countries of Europe. What we've seen when people have talked about curtailing flights as part of the laudable goal of reducing our emissions and bringing our climate change under control, or making a contribution to that. It's a laudable goal, but tackling it by cutting off flights and getting people to fly less and curtailing our flight options actually could be counterproductive, and it hits the peripheral regions of Europe, of which Ireland is one.
How counterproductive? I understand damaging to tourism, damaging to aviation. How would it be counterproductive in terms of combating climate change?
Generally, people sort of hold up rail is the way to go. When you actually factor in the production of the electricity for rail, but especially the manufacture process and all the other factors, and you balance not just the fuel burn, because when people are measuring this, they just look at aviation fuel burn and they look at electric rail fuel burn. When you factor in other everything else, the overall contribution to emissions is balanced out. The other really important thing is that when people talk about aviation fuel burn, they really always concentrate on airlines and the commercial aviation sector, which isn't the largest contributor to this by any means. In terms of economic damage, which is completely related to the damage, the overall measurement of the damage, and I don't want to sound like the rural TD here saying it's people against the planet. It isn't. The economic damage and the ability of Ireland to function and do things for climate change will be adversely affected by anything that damages our credibility. I say damages our credibility, our connectivity, damages our connectivity. It's not just damaged at the moment, it's been seriously damaged, and anything else to add to that is going to contribute. Everything we do, we're an island, all our trading, all our family connections and all our tourism is by plane.
John Gibbons is an environmental journalist and commentator. John, you heard Eoghan there setting out quite a few objections he would have to this proposal. Do you agree with any of them?
Hello, Ciaran. Well, first of all, I think as we've seen during lockdown, most of our connectivity, in fact, with the rest of the world isn't by plane at all. Of course, it's electronically, and Ireland is very well served electronically. And what we've seen, actually, Ciaran, as well, during lockdown, for all its many ills, is that we've discovered that a huge amount of flying and travel around the place, like these vital international conferences that people were jetting backward and forward to, what you find now are business people saying, actually, these things are a huge waste of time. You know, we go to a conference in Boston, we bring half the company, we're there for 4 days, it costs a fortune, we all fly, we get nothing done, we come back jet lagged.
I don't know where John is hearing any of that.
Now with video conferencing perfectly well. So I think one of the upsides of the lockdown has been that we've actually been able to see that a lot of what was believed to be essential flying, such as a lot of these business jollies, have turned out to be nothing of the kind. And in one of the sectors I'm very familiar with, say the medical area, there are huge amounts of international travel for this very reason. And much of that, the kind of conferences, by the way, that we're talking about, these, International Diabetes Federation Conference and so on, these have all switched online. And guess what? They're probably more productive.
Okay, well,
people
John,
are not spending
Is there any need? So, is there any need then for things like quotas? I mean, if the experience is possibly going to be that these big employers are going to say, "There's no need for you to fly business class off to Shanghai to that conference. You can just catch it on Zoom."
Yeah, I mean, I think our experience that we can get by without an awful lot of pointless aviation that is apart from destroying the environment is also dragging people in many cases unnecessarily around the world. So I do believe, we can get rid of some of that, but I don't think it's enough. For example, a study that was published at the end of last month found that what they called an elite minority of frequent flyers, they're the ones that are doing the damage. Now, you take a rich country like America, only 12% of people in America are taking 66% of the flights. So 1 in 8 people taking 2/3 of the flights. These are well-off people. There is this notion that flying is this great democratic thing that we can all do and it's cheap. Now, unfortunately, flying, by the way, is a wonderful thing. I'm not a antediluvian about this. Flying is a magnificent, fantastic thing and gives us all kinds of benefits. However, we're not paying the true cost of flying. In fact, flying is costed and subsidized like no other sector on earth. And most importantly, the emissions, this is the emissions gap that has been left out of all our calculations for flying. And anybody listening to us now knows full well that they could get an Aer Lingus flight probably, or a Ryanair flight down to Spain for less than the cost of getting the train to Cork. Now, you got to ask yourself, does that actually make sense at all? And how is flying so ridiculously cheap? Apart from the hundreds of millions that taxpayers around Europe and around the world pour into it, we also, of course, give the aviation sector tax breaks like no other sector can dream of. But if every litre, Ciaran, that you put of fuel in your car, you're paying maybe 70, 80 cents a litre in various types of levies and so on. The same litre of aviation fuel, which, by the way, does twice as much damage as that litre of petrol in terms of environmental damage, they're paying nothing. Absolutely nothing.
I want to go back because I know Eoghan was trying to jump in there. Eoghan?
It's going to take a while to cut through all the contrail of delusion that's been left there by that. Aviation fuel is not free. What John is referring to is not taxed in the same way as your litre of fuel. That does not amount to a subsidy. The notion that most flying is done as jollies and is unnecessary, the experience since lockdown has been the opposite. People do business with people. They don't do business with organisations. The milk powder that Ireland sends to China doesn't travel electronically. The things we import in the other direction do not travel electronically. There's a lot because commercial aviation has become democratized, and that's what John is saying, that he wants to get the price of aviation right back up to what we remember in the 80s when it cost €300 to fly to London, and it was an elite because it was democratized. Taking away that process or rolling back that process isn't really going to achieve anything except kill off huge sectors of our economy, such as those that rely on tourism, hospitality, and travel in the other direction. It's an interconnected world. We can't go back to the Middle Ages.
Yeah, John, just on that point, I suppose, because, in fairness, you did acknowledge that it is an elite who are flying. I mean, if you were to get rid of all those subsidies, the argument might be that you might stop the teacher or the guard or the nurse going to Malaga on holidays, but the elite who are doing the damage, who are doing those 66% of flights, those 12% of people doing 66% of flights, they'll still do it because they can afford it.
Yeah, I think a better approach than simply, obviously we need to tax every economic activity needs to be taxed according to its impacts. At the moment, aviation has a free ride. We know that.
It doesn't.
However, Sorry, Eoghan, I didn't interrupt you on your contrails of delusion. So if you'll leave me finish the point.
Very happy to do so. Yeah.
And also, by the way, if I could also clarify for Eoghan, I'm not sure if Eoghan thinks that milk powder is flown to China. In fact, when the Suez was recently blocked, we had a lot of Irish milk powder sitting in the Suez Canal. So I'm not sure where he's getting his idea that all trade, very little trade, goes by aircraft.
It's very important part of Emirates cargo. It's very important part of Emirates cargo.
The bulk of trade in and out of Ireland, as Eoghan should know, given that he's an industry lobbyist, he should know this.
I'm not an industry lobbyist. Sorry, John. I'm a journalist like you are.
Sorry, an industry activist. Sorry, Eoghan. Right. You should know that the bulk of trade in and out of this island nation comes on ships. Aviation is really much smaller than that. And I suppose critically important as well, we've got to ask ourselves, right? We know, for example, that greenhouse gases from aviation have more than doubled since 1990. In some calculations, they're now over 13% of the GHGs in the European Union. If we continue on our current trajectory post-recovery, we're looking at over 20% of global emissions by 2050 being accounted for by aviation. Now, bear in mind, Ciaran, that only less than 1 in 10 people in the world will ever set foot in an aircraft. Over 90% of the world's population, the people who are currently getting hammered by climate change, the ones who are subsidising the cheap travel that Eoghan seems to believe is a God-given right. And I should say as well, in 2019, the last time we had full activity, we had 35 million passenger movements in and out of Ireland. Now, do you think 35 million passenger movements for a country with 5 million people, that this is some kind of critical thing, that we can't cut down on that? And I think, finally, Ciaran, you asked the question, and I'll answer it briefly if I may, and that is, in order to make sure that the elite flyers are not hogging it, the way you do that is you apply a rapidly escalating levy system. In other words, your first 1,500 kilometres, there's no charge. Your next 1,000, your next 5,000, the rate goes up. That means that Joe and Mary, the teacher, who want to go to Malaga, that's fine. They go once, that's fine. That's allowed for. But the guys who decide it is their God-given right to travel hither and thither at the drop of a hat, off to Hong Kong, popping down to Australia, flying over to the West Coast because they think they're so important, that's fine. They need to be hammered with levies that reflect the long-term damage that they're doing to the environment. And by the way, that environment is the place that their kids are going to have to live in one of these days.
And then just before I let both of you go, what about that? I suppose the democratisation up to a certain mileage.
Yeah, first of all, I'm not an industry lobbyist or an activist. My job is analysis, not advocacy, and that's why I'm here today. The second thing is that my analysis mightn't agree with yours, John, and I make no apology for that. My job is to tell, as a journalist, read the data that's out there and tell it as a journalist to the public. That's all I'm doing here. So I hopefully we can do that without being accused of lobbying or being an activist or being sort of partisan for other reasons, for non-journalistic reasons. The notion that Ireland can reduce our lifestyle flights, and yes, there are 35 million on and off the island. The reason is it's the only way you can get to and from Ireland. We don't have the land connectivity that Central Europe does. So when somebody comes up and says, let's start curtailing commercial travel, commercial flights, we are the ones who are going to be hit. We are the ones on the periphery. The islands off Europe are the ones that are going to be hit. And if that was crucial in the entire climate change debate, yes, there would be a case for making this, you take the hit, guys, because nobody else is. But if you were to count, for instance, the US Air Force commercial fuel burn, it's bigger than the entire commercial fleet in Europe. So you're asking people to forgo, the leisure travel to try and do your little bit while somebody else.
It's always a little bit like, why should I bother not littering? Sure, look at the coal plants in China. But listen, before I let you go, Eoghan, I just want to mention, because it is a story today from your industry, John Walsh Travel, no longer in existence.
Joe Walsh Travel, yes, Ciaran, yeah. It's a sad day. It's of no iconic brand, not just in travel, but if you were to go through consumer culture in Ireland, what Joe Walsh did in the 1960s was introduce travel to a lot of people who couldn't afford it. Pilgrimage is the last thing they were doing, and they've closed the operation today. There will be about between 10 and 20,000, normally 35,000 people a year go out on pilgrimage from Ireland, but certainly a 5-figure number of people will be hit. It's a little bit more complicated by COVID because these are not very tech savvy people. They tend to be an older demographic, and making sure they don't lose their deposits. I don't think there's a lot of pilgrimages paid up fully for. There will be quite a few. That is going to have to be a priority because these are elderly people. They're not really, don't go on very, very many international trips. And these are the ones that are impacted by Joe Walsh's closure today. A sad day for the history of travel in Ireland and for the 10 or 20,000 people who are affected.
Eoghan Corry, Travel.
Always a pleasure, Ciaran.
Travel magazine.
And thank you to John.
John Gibbons, environmental journalist.